What is going on, everybody? This is Yes I Read That, and today I am reviewing AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee. Alright, this book. I randomly saw this book somewhere and it sounded interesting to me, so I decided I'd read it. I did that and it was interesting, but it definitely had some flaws, or at least it had a style that I didn't really enjoy. Kind of a sensationalist style. But anyways, I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I'm gonna talk a bit about the content of the book so you actually know what the author talks about, and I'm going to talk about my likes and dislikes and my score for the book. But first, the author himself, he's actually a pretty important person. I think he was voted like the Times top 100 most influential people in the world or something like that, and he is like he worked for a bunch of tech companies, and actually in the field of artificial intelligence he worked in this field all his life, and I feel like he's very knowledgeable and also has a ton of experience. So to know how immersed the author is in the field, that actually makes the book a ton better already. So let's get into the content of the book. Alright, in the beginning, Kai-Fu Lee shows what his image of the AI superpower nations in the future looks like. Meaning the nations where AI transforms software, transforms how we live our lives basically, and the nations where it does so the most. And in his opinion, these include the US and China. So he is actually originally from Taiwan and worked in the US, worked in China, and he has a lot of insight in both of these cultures. And he decided that the US is the current leader, but he believes that China will catch up or is already catching up, and he presents his points why China will be one of the two AI superpowers and how they can transform the world. Now, to do this and to do like an introduction into Chinese culture, he actually talks about Chinese startup culture, how it was actually developed, how the government helped push this startup culture, this, creating startup incubators, and how the Chinese startups just went ham. The Chinese copycat culture, how some people call it, that they just copy a product that's already good and then only later think about how they can improve it. And he shows how for every business idea there is not just one startup, but there are always multiple ones, and only the best of them actually pulls through and makes it. So that's already very interesting insight on the Chinese culture and Chinese business culture, I guess. He also explains what key areas there are for AI development. I'm not going to go into these now, but he also checks how the state of these is in the US and in China. And then he goes on to explain what areas of application he sees and how the US and China compare in that regard. Through these comparisons, you can get a lot of insight into Chinese culture. I feel like there's more insight into Chinese culture than the US culture here, but that's probably because he worked most of his life in China. So some of the stuff you get to know is some of the cultural aspects of China, some of the startup culture, as I said already, and also some information how the Chinese government does its business, I guess, or rules the nation. And the last thing he does is he explains how AI might transform our job sector and how we could deal with like job losses and what humans could do to find a purpose in life and all of that kind of stuff. Which honestly I didn't really enjoy that much and thought that was pretty irrelevant, but I'll get to that later. So that's the basic content. He talks about mainly the US and China. He says sometimes that France has a bunch of people doing research on that, and he doesn't really talk about Europe at all. He doesn't really talk about India or Africa at all. So it's a very focused view, but I think he's definitely not wrong, because the buzz is slowly starting in Europe as well, but I think Europeans are just not... I'm not going to say they're not innovative, but sometimes they're cautious when using new technology, and they only want to use it once it's proven that it actually works. Alright, so let's get into my likes for this book. First thing that I really enjoyed is you can actually learn a lot about the culture of AI development in China and in the US. So obviously, as I said before, the author Kai-Fu Lee, he has immense knowledge. By the way, I don't know how to pronounce his name or if I'm doing it remotely correctly. I apologize if it's wrong. I just don't know. So he has a lot of knowledge in this area and he's an expert. He has really good information which you can learn in this book. Also, the book isn't too long, so it's kind of a good read to get into the topic and just not sink a ton of time into it. So I think that's a plus for this book. And the last thing I really enjoyed was a lot of insight into Chinese culture. As I said, there wasn't as much into US culture, but I really enjoyed every aspect he explained about Chinese culture and Chinese business culture, because for me that's just so unknown, and I feel like Western media is not very fair sometimes to Chinese companies. For sure there are reasons for that, but yeah, I think that's a good book to read for that as well. So overall, from a technical perspective and like cultural perspective, I found this book very interesting, but I still had a lot of problems with it as well. So I'm gonna get to my dislikes. And disclaimer here, I have very strong opinions on the subject. I'm in touch with the subject a bit, like through my educational and career development, I guess. So I'm gonna talk about a few things that I really didn't enjoy and that I think are kind of weird. So first of all, he is incredibly sensationalist, which I don't really have a big problem with, but for this AI and artificial intelligence buzz, really, there is a lot of hype, and there aren't that many areas where AI actually outperforms humans yet, and that includes autonomous driving. I believe that in some areas AI will definitely be better than humans. And he includes some good examples like a medical field where, for example, AI can learn from images or from whatever input where like what disease this is with a very high accuracy, way higher than humans. And I think that's a really good application example, but he doesn't really provide too many of them, and he always keeps saying how this will transform our entire lives, which I just really don't necessarily agree with yet, but we'll see. But it feels a bit like buzzword bingo, to be honest. And one thing he doesn't address at all are problems with AI that haven't been solved. Like one problem is adversarial examples, which is if you feed some input into the machine, that every human can tell you that, for example, image recognition. You have an image and it's clearly some animal. You might give that to a machine and it will say, for example, it's a cat. Give an almost identical looking image that a human can't tell the difference, and the machine will say cow, because it's an example crafted precisely to fool the machine. And this is a big problem. There has even been like the development of a sticker. It's called the adversarial patch. You stick it on any object and it becomes a toaster to the AI. And this is a huge problem. There hasn't been any solution to it yet. Next problem is more like, well, I'm not sure if this is a big problem per se, but it's something to consider. You know, the AI will make decisions. For example, you try to get a loan and some algorithm decides you won't get one. And now you go to the bank and say, I didn't get a loan, I'm going to sue you. What are they going to do? They're going to say, yeah, we actually don't know why you didn't get one, but our AI decided that you don't get one. So, I mean, it's kind of weird. And some problems, like, there are some really big problems when it comes to autonomous driving. Say the car has like the choice between driving over 2 people to the left or 3 people to the right. What does it do? Nobody knows, and you can't even tell. Like, there are problems with it. So I definitely feel like this book is very over enthusiastic for AI, but I'm sure some AI applications are going to arrive, even though a lot of them have been horrible so far. Like, let's say it has an error rate of 1% or 0.5%. It doesn't seem too bad until you realize that for 200 people, there's already 1 or 2 people who get screwed over by the AI, and nobody can do anything because it's the AI that decided this stuff and there's no human involved. So it's it's challenging. Alright, and the next point is that this is something where I don't really have knowledge, but I feel like this book is biased towards China. I know that a lot of points in this book are very valid, but I also don't really agree with some of them. And I already know that China is huge and is investing a lot of money into AI, but still there are a few reasons. I'm going to list them now. So first of all, China is behind in AI research. That's a fact, and he also acknowledges it in the book. It's behind the US, which is probably the world leader. And there's a reason for that, and it's historical, it's also cultural, because Chinese culture is just completely different. They are just, for a fact, at least historically, less innovative than US culture and companies. So what I mean with this is basically he glorifies China. He says their research is top-notch nowadays, which honestly I know, at least in my research field, that papers compared from the US and China, there's not not always. Some papers from China are very good, but some papers just aren't up to the standards, and there is some reason for that. I don't know why. I know that China has a lot of smart people working there, and I don't know, but the fact is that there is a difference, at least in research. And he says he writes things like 1 week of work in Shenzhen is like 1 month in the US. And sorry, but that is just complete bullshit. If that is the case, then that's either because there are more restrictions in the US, usually safety restrictions, which really makes sense because in some areas China is really lacking safety restrictions. Anyways, and the other thing might be that Chinese people have a crazy work culture and it's not healthy, it's not something you should promote. If you're interested in that, Google 996 culture China and you'll find a ton of stuff on Google. What I'm trying to say is, if it's actually true that 1 week of work in Shenzhen is worth as much as a month in the US, there are reasons for that, and it's really questionable if that's actually desirable. It might be true, I don't really believe it, but it might be true, and I don't think it's a good thing per se. Just the result isn't going to be exactly the same. The last dislike I have isn't really related to the 2 points before at all. It's more that the last part of the book about how our jobs will transform is very far-fetched in my opinion. He also deals with his history with cancer, where he decided that he was only working and not taking time to appreciate his life. And I feel like that doesn't really have much to do with the book, and the conclusion of pretty much a long part of this book is just that, people do what people do best, being emotional and helping other people, and machines do some of the mechanical tasks, I guess, that humans won't need to do in the future. But to be honest, that's so far away that I don't know. It feels like I don't really see why he made that. People are gonna have to figure it out themselves, and they're gonna figure it out. So he also writes a very interesting point, though. Let me get that in. I said a lot of dislikes, but for example, there's another very interesting point. He wrote that the Chinese government, so people trust the Chinese government to do the right thing if wealth inequality gets too big. For example, because the people who own AI have everything, and people who don't have access, or the lower classes or something, they get a very tough life because they don't ever develop their own technology, and they can't catch up with the big guys because the big get bigger and bigger. So that's an interesting part about the Chinese government, where people have a very different outlook, I guess, than in the German system, for example. But yeah, so it sounded like I just trashed the book a bit, but those are just some more nitpicks, or I just don't like this overhyped stuff. I want to see, especially in a technology book, I want to see a kind of objective approach, and it just wasn't here. So my overall score for the book is a 6 out of 10. From a technical and cultural perspective, I really liked it. I just didn't really enjoy the writing style, this super overdramatic and stuff like that. I almost stopped reading a few times, but I pushed through, and I'm glad I did, because the book is actually pretty insightful at times. And if you're just interested in the technology and the culture, read the first 2/3 of the book and skip the rest. But I think the book is really worth reading, even though I had some problems with it. So yeah. If you read the book, let me know what you thought in the comments below. Otherwise, that's it for my review. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to drop a like, maybe sub to this channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Till then, bye!